snow had a way of quieting the world back then, as if it wanted every hurt thing to be heard before it froze solid and vanished. I remember that winter the way an old man remembers his first prayer, uncertain of the words, but sure of the feeling. The snow fell without anger or mercy, just endless and soft, turning the plains white and the sky into a single breathing thing. Even now, when my bones ache, that memory warms me, because that was the night a frightened girl hid in a barn and believed she had reached the end of hope, not knowing hope was already reaching for her, just beyond a creaking door. Mika Red Willow ran until her lungs burned like they were filled with broken glass, her boots sinking deep into snow that grabbed at her ankles as if the earth itself wanted to keep her still. She was only 20, though fear had already aged her far beyond that, carving lessons into her heart she never asked to learn. The store owner's hands were still on her in memory, heavy with entitlement, his voice thick with promises that felt like threats. When she realized his kindness had always been a trap, she fled into the night without a coat, without direction, carrying nothing but the certainty that if she stayed, she would disappear piece by piece. The cold clawed at her skin, the darkness pressed close, and when she found the abandoned barn, she slipped inside like a secret too ashamed to speak, believing the world always chose powerful men over silent women, and wondering who would find her first, the storm or something worse. The barn smelled of old hay and time, of animals long gone and stories no one remembered. Mika curled herself into the corner, pulling her knees to her chest, breath shallow so no sound would betray her. Moonlight slipped through the cracks in the wood, catching the dust in the air, and making it look like ghosts drifting slowly downward. She told herself she would stay silent no matter what, because silence had always been safer than truth, even as fear trembled through her bones. Then the wind shifted, the snow hushed for a moment, and the barn door creaked open with a sound that felt like fate clearing its throat. Jack Wilder stepped inside carrying a lantern, snow clinging to his coat and beard, his shoulders heavy with a grief that had settled there years ago and never quite left. He was 33, though sorrow had etched lines into his face that made him look older in certain lights. He paused, sensing something wrong the way a man learns to sense weather before it breaks, and though his hand rested near his gun, he didn't draw it. The lantern swung gently, spilling warm light across the barn, and when it reached Mika's face, she flinched, certain this was how she would be found and returned. Jack's eyes softened instead, not with desire or judgment, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had once been cornered by loss himself. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice low and careful, as if loud words might shatter her completely. He shrugged off his coat and held it out before even asking her name, a gesture so simple it startled her more than cruelty would have. Mika shook her head, mistrust rising like a shield, because trust had always cost her dearly. The snow tapped gently on the barn roof, steady as a heartbeat, while the lantern light softened the hard edges of both their faces. When she finally whispered that she worked for Silas Boone, Jack's jaw tightened just enough to tell a story he didn't yet speak aloud. After a moment that stretched thin as ice, he said, almost to himself, "I cannot leave you alone, you must come with me," and in that quiet sentence Mika felt the weight of a choice she had never been offered before. She stepped into the snow beside him, the storm swallowing her fear inch by inch as they walked toward his horse. The ride was slow, careful, as if both understood haste would only break what little steadiness they'd found. Jack wrapped her frozen hands around a tin cup of coffee, guiding without touching, and she noticed the wedding band hanging from a string around his neck, worn smooth by memory. When he spoke of his wife dying in childbirth years ago, there were no tears in his voice, just a truth laid down gently between them. Mika hummed an old song her mother used to sing, barely louder than the wind, and Jack walked when her horse tired, leading it through drifts that seemed determined to test them. When the town lights finally appeared through the snowfall, Mika's heart sank, because safety had always come with a price she was tired of paying. The town greeted them with stares sharp enough to cut through wool and skin alike, whispers following like shadows. Sheriff Amos Calder questioned Jack openly, his tone practiced and wary, while Silas Boone's lies slithered through the crowd, painting Micah as a thief, a seductress, a problem that needed containing. Micah lowered her eyes, already bracing for chains, while Jack stood beside her in silence, his presence a steady thing that did not waver even when judgment pressed close. The sheriff allowed her temporary shelter, but warned Jack with a look that said kindness could become a crime here. That night, as Micah lay awake listening to the wind, she heard her name spoken like a curse and wondered how much longer she could endure being seen as less than human. Jack offered her his cabin when the storm refused to relent, a small sanctuary warmed by firelight and the quiet steadiness of patience. The scent of simmering soup filled the air, boots dried by the hearth, and for the first time in days Micah felt the tightness in her chest ease, like snow melting under the timid sun. Love did not announce itself with grand gestures here. It unfolded in the gentlest of ways, Jack's rough fingers fumbling as he braided her hair, trying to steady hands that trembled from more than cold, Micah's needle tracing careful stitches in his coat, each one a silent prayer. One night, the silence between them grew thick with unspoken fears, and Micah whispered that she felt like borrowed time, a life meant to be reclaimed by a world too cruel to care. Jack cupped her face gently, his voice low and unwavering. Then stay until time learns better. Snow trapped them together outside and inside alike, and when Micah reached for his hand in the darkness, it felt like something she had been searching for all her life. Not possession, not safety, but the simple, perfect truth of being seen and held. The town grew colder with each passing day. Boone leaned harder on the sheriff, twisting words and reputations, while women who once smiled at Micah now turned their backs, their eyes full of silent accusation. Rumors spread like wildfire, and one bitter morning she overheard Jack being whispered about, accused of corruption he had never sought, a man whose only crime was seeing her as human. Micah's heart sank beneath the weight of it all. By dawn, she packed quietly, believing that leaving might hurt less than staying and causing more pain for someone else. Each movement was careful, deliberate, as if by being unseen she could protect them both. Jack stepped into the doorway before she could leave, snow crunching softly beneath his boot. He did not raise his hand, did not demand or threaten. Instead, he spoke, voice low, raw, shaking just enough to show the truth behind his words. I cannot survive another loss, not one chosen by fear. His eyes held her, vulnerability and pleading entwined in their depths. Micah faltered, breath catching, looking up at him, and then she heard it, the faint, deliberate crunch of footsteps approaching the cabin, carrying with them the threat of exposure and the unspoken possibility of salvation, leaving her suspended between fear and trust. Justice came the way winter storms often do, sudden and undeniable. A former store clerk spoke up, Boone's lies collapsed under their own weight, and when he tried to flee, the snow took him down hard and ungracefully. Sheriff Amos listened at last, shame written plainly across his face, as he ordered Boone arrested for assault and coercion. Micah spoke her truth aloud for the first time, her voice trembling but unbroken, and the town stood silent, confronted with the cost of its blindness. When the sheriff turned toward Jack and Micah, something in his expression had changed, as if winter itself had taught him a lesson. Apologies came the way healing often does, softly, almost shy, but with a weight cruelty never carried. A basket left at the door before dawn, steam still rising. A man pausing long enough to remove his hat and bow his head, as if finally seeing Micah as a person and not a rumor. None of it could undo the harm, yet each small act stitched something back together, and with every passing day Micah felt her spine straighten, her breath deepen, learning that survival no longer required her to make herself smaller. She was allowed to take up space now, and the world did not break because of it. Jack asked for nothing in return. Justice, once spoken and believed, was enough to quiet the long ache in him. And when he knelt in the snow weeks later, his knees sinking into the cold, his eyes held every loss, every hope, every fear of loving again. He never rushed the words. He didn't need to. Mika's answer was already there, in the tears she let fall, in the way she reached for him, and in the certainty that love, once chosen, does not need permission to stay. They married outside the cabin while the world held its breath. Snow drifted down in slow, reverent spirals, settling into Mika's hair and on Jack's shoulders as if heaven itself wished to witness what was being joined. Mika wore the blue beadwork her mother had made with patient hands long gone, each bead catching the pale light like a memory that refused to fade. Jack placed his late wife's ring into Mika's trembling palm before sliding it onto her finger, his voice breaking as he told her it was not a shadow of the past, but a promise that love, once given, only learns how to grow. Their vows were uneven and halting, stitched together from truth rather than poetry, yet every word carried the weight of survival and choosing each other again and again. When they kissed, it was slow and certain, tasting of cold air and fragile hope, of all the nights they had endured to arrive at that single moment. The snow continued to fall around them, soft and unending, and when spring eventually came, loosening the earth and greening the hills, it did not feel like an escape from winter, but a gentle permission to believe that happiness was no longer something borrowed, but something finally, completely their own. Marriage did not arrive with thunder or fanfare, but with 1,000 quiet mercies that stitched their days together. Mornings were shared in the half-light, Jack warming Mika's hands before either of them spoke, the kettle singing softly as if it knew it was part of their happiness. They worked side by side, laughter rising over burnt bread and clumsy mistakes, finding joy not in perfection but in the simple fact of being allowed to remain. Touches lingered now, not out of fear of losing time, but because time had finally slowed for them, granting permission to rest in each other's presence. Love revealed itself in these ordinary hours, steady as breath, growing deeper precisely because it asked for nothing loud or grand. One evening, as firelight danced across the cabin walls, Mika took Jack's hand and placed it gently against her belly, her eyes shining with a hope that trembled between fear and wonder. Jack went very still, as if the world had narrowed to that single heartbeat beneath his palm, and when he looked at her, his eyes filled with something raw and reverent, a gratitude too deep for words. In that moment, he understood that the future was no longer something to endure, but something alive and waiting. Their daughter came with the first snowfall of the next winter, the world turning white again, as if to honor how their love had begun. They named her Elena Snowbird Wilder, a promise wrapped in a name, and when Jack held her, he wept without shame, grief and joy finally finding the same gentle release in his chest. Mika cradled their child against her heart, listening to her soft breaths, and knew with a certainty that settled deep into her bones that she was no longer borrowed time, no longer hiding, she was home, she was loved, and she belonged. Now, as I tell you this, I want you to hold it close, the way you would a fragile truth on a cold night. I learned that love is not the absence of winter, it is the shelter two hearts build when the cold refuses to ease. It is the quiet choosing of one another when the world feels sharp and unkind. Dignity, I saw, is not granted by others. It is preserved in the way someone looks at you and refuses to turn away. And kindness, true kindness, is a soft rebellion, a hand extended when everything else teaches us to harden our fists. Sometimes salvation does not arrive with raised voices or sudden light. Sometimes it comes as a single lantern glowing in the dark, carried by someone who does not ask for your story before offering warmth. If you are hiding now, afraid that being seen will only bring more pain, remember this: winter is not always the end. Sometimes it is where life gathers its courage. Somewhere, in the falling snow, there is a soul willing to step beside you, match your pace, and promise, without needing words, that you will not have to walk alone ever again.